It was dawn over France in 1944. The sky trembled with the distant hum of engines, 1,000 aircraft slicing through the clouds on their way to destiny. Inside one of those planes, the men sat in silence, their helmets pressed low, their hands gripping rifles slick with sweat. The air was thick with fear and purpose, the kind that only comes before a storm. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Every man there knew what was waiting below. A red light glowed above the door, a signal that would soon turn green, commanding them to leap from safety into the chaos of war. One by one they stood, adjusting their straps and checking their gear, their breath steady but shallow. When the light finally changed, they jumped. Dozens of figures hurled themselves into the night, swallowed by the darkness and gunfire below. In those moments, they ceased to be ordinary men. They became something greater, fragments of courage falling through the sky. They were paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, America's new kind of soldier. But they weren't alone in carrying the nation's hopes across the world. There were others. The 1st Infantry Division, hardened by every front from North Africa to the beaches of Normandy. The Marines in the Pacific, who bled through jungles and beaches most Americans had never heard of. And the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, Japanese-American soldiers who fought with unmatched bravery for a country that once imprisoned their families. Each of these units carved its legend into the earth, leaving behind a story written not in ink, but in blood and sacrifice. Every battle, every inch of ground, every comrade lost added another verse to the great, brutal hymn of World War II. And behind every act of valor stood a question that still lingers decades later. Which of them was truly the best? Was greatness measured by victory, by endurance, or by the cost of loyalty? Some became immortalized in film and memory, their names forever spoken with reverence. Others vanished into dusty records and forgotten graves. Yet all of them, in their own way, carried the same burden, the duty to fight, and if necessary, to die for something larger than themselves. The world was on fire, and America's sons had been called to extinguish it. What emerged from that inferno were not just soldiers, but symbols, the living definition of courage, resilience, and sacrifice. Before the guns, before the blood and the mud, there was a dream, an idea that the United States could stand as a shield between tyranny and freedom. When war first consumed Europe, America watched from across the ocean, weary of the same continent that had dragged it into the trenches only 2 decades earlier. But the illusion of distance would not last. By 1941, the fire had reached Pearl Harbor, and America's dream of peace shattered beneath the rising smoke. The attack did more than awaken a sleeping giant. It united a divided nation. Overnight, factories turned into foundries of war, and cities pulsed with new purpose. The young and the restless lined up at recruiting stations, some fueled by anger, others by duty, and many by a quiet conviction that history had chosen their generation to defend the world. From farmlands and factories, from city streets and small towns, millions answered the call. But among them, a few stood apart, men who wanted to test themselves beyond the limits of ordinary service. They volunteered for something new, something unproven. Paratroopers, Rangers, Marines, and bomber crews, units forged through brutal training that stripped away the weak and left only those who refused to break. They were told their missions would be dangerous, often suicidal, and still they signed their names. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were born in that spirit. They would be America's sword from the sky. Men who would jump behind enemy lines and fight surrounded. The training was merciless. Long marches, endless drills, and instructors who spoke in curses instead of encouragement. Yet, within that crucible, something rare took shape: brotherhood. These men would not fight for medals or headlines, but for each other. Across the ocean, the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, had already tasted war in North Africa. They were the old guard, the battle-hardened veterans who carried the scars of Tunisia and Sicily. Their belief was simpler: endure, advance, survive. To them, glory meant living through another day. To the paratroopers, glory meant jumping into hell with a grin. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the United States Marine Corps faced a war like no other, brutal, personal, and fought yard by yard. On Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima, the Marines discovered that the enemy would not surrender, even in defeat. It was a war stripped of illusions. No speeches, no applause, just the primal will to live another hour. Then there was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit of Japanese Americans who volunteered to fight for a nation that questioned their loyalty. Their families sat behind barbed wire in internment camps while they marched into Europe wearing the same uniform as every other American soldier. Their belief in America was not naive. It was defiant. They would prove their worth the only way they could, by fighting harder than anyone else. Each of these units believed in something: freedom, brotherhood, redemption, or simple survival. But belief is fragile in war. The coming years would test those convictions in ways none of them could imagine. Some would rise into legend. Others would be shattered beneath the weight of impossible orders. For now, though, they believed in the righteousness of their cause. They believed their fight would end the darkness spreading across the world. And they believed, perhaps most tragically of all, that they would make a home. By 1943, the United States had transformed into a war machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Convoys stretched across the Atlantic, steel waves carrying tanks, weapons, and men toward Europe's shores. In the Pacific, island after island was set ablaze as the Marines advanced toward Japan, each battle a brutal step closer to the heart of the enemy. The one-silent factories of Detroit and Chicago thundered with purpose, producing the lifeblood of victory: weapons, planes, and hope. The alliances that shaped the war were fragile but necessary. America had joined hands with Britain and the Soviet Union. Nations bound not by trust, but by a shared hatred of tyranny. Each carried its own scars and ambitions, but together they formed the backbone of the Allied war effort. To the soldiers on the ground, politics mattered little. What mattered was surviving the next mission and trusting the man beside you to do the same. For the men of the 101st Airborne, their first test came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. As their C-47s crossed the English Channel, tracer fire climbed into the night sky like furious stars. The jump into Normandy was chaos, scattered landings, lost equipment, and confusion in the dark. Yet the paratroopers adapted, forming ad hoc units, fighting from hedgerows and farmhouses, cutting German lines with sheer determination. By dawn, their patches, the Screaming Eagle, had become a symbol of defiance. The 101st held firm where others might have faltered, proving that courage and chaos could coexist. Meanwhile, the 1st Infantry Division stormed Omaha Beach. The waves turned red as men fell before they could even raise their rifles. The first assault nearly failed, but the Big Red One refused to yield. Crawling through smoke and sand, they clawed their way up the bluffs, silencing bunkers one grenade at a time. That day, they didn't just take the beach, they carved the path for every Allied soldier who would follow. Their motto, "No mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great," wasn't just words. It was survival. Across the globe, in the Pacific, the Marines faced a different kind of hell. On Tarawa, the ocean itself became an enemy. Reefs trapped landing craft, forcing men to wade through waist-deep water while Japanese guns tore them apart. The air smelled of salt and blood, the sand so hot it burned through their boots. Yet still they advanced. Each battle was a lesson in endurance, in how far the human body could be pushed before it broke. Then came the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. In Italy and France, they fought with fury unmatched. They rescued the lost battalion of Texas, surrounded and written off as doomed, by charging through German fire and suffering devastating losses. When it was over, they had saved hundreds of men, but at a terrible cost. The 442nd became one of the most decorated units in American history, earning over 18,000 awards in a war that had once doubted their loyalty. Their legacy was not just bravery, it was redemption. As 1944 bled into 1945, these units stood as the backbone of the Allied advance. The 101st and 82nd Airborne liberated towns across France and the Netherlands, greeted as heroes by civilians who wept in the streets. The 1st Infantry marched relentlessly toward Germany, their uniforms faded, their faces hollow from years of battle. The Marines raised a flag on Mount Suribachi at Iwo Jima, a moment that froze courage in time. The 442nd, still fighting through Europe, carried the quiet dignity of men who had nothing left to prove. Victory seemed inevitable. The alliance between nations had held, the tide had turned, and freedom was within reach. But victory, in war, never comes without its price. The same courage that carried these men forward would soon lead many of them into their darkest hour. Because as the Allies closed in on Hitler's collapsing empire and as the Pacific burned toward Japan, the cost of being the best was about to reveal itself. By the winter of 1944, the war had reached its breaking point. The Allies were winning, but victory came wrapped in exhaustion. The men who had stormed beaches and liberated cities were now worn thin, their faces aged beyond their years. Frostbite, hunger, and grief replaced the adrenaline that had once carried them forward. Yet, in that bleak December, one final trial awaited them, a test that would separate legends from history. It came in the Ardennes. The world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. The snow fell endlessly, blanketing Europe in silence as the German army launched one last desperate assault. Entire divisions vanished into the fog. Communication lines were cut. Ammunition dwindled. And there, in the small Belgian town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne found themselves surrounded. For days, they fought with almost nothing. No air support, little food, no warm clothing. Frostbitten and isolated, they held the line against tanks and artillery that seemed endless. The men dug into frozen ground, their rifles stiff with ice. Still, they refused to surrender. When the Germans demanded their capitulation, General Anthony McAuliffe gave a one-word reply that became immortal: nuts. It was defiance distilled into a single syllable. The 101st held Bastogne until reinforcements arrived, proving once again that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep fighting despite it. The 1st Infantry Division, meanwhile, was pushing into Germany. They saw the ruins of cities, the faces of civilians who had lost everything, and the horrific camps that revealed the full weight of Nazi cruelty. Victory no longer felt glorious. The soldiers who had once dreamed of medals and parades now simply wanted the killing to end. Yet, they pushed on, step by step, carrying the burden of what they had seen. In the Pacific, betrayal came not from the enemy, but from the sheer brutality of nature and command. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Marines were ordered to take ground where every inch cost lives. They obeyed because that was their duty. But duty, in those final months, felt like madness. Waves of men stormed beaches under relentless fire, knowing many would never return. The enemy refused to surrender, and so neither could they. By the time the American flag rose over Mount Suribachi, victory had already claimed too many souls to feel like triumph. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, after months of unrelenting combat, returned home to a country still divided by suspicion and prejudice. They had fought for freedom, but many returned to find their families still behind fences in internment camps. Their loyalty had been proven 100 times over, yet their sacrifices were met with silence. It was the cruelest betrayal of all, to give everything for a nation that could not see you as one of its own. The alliances that had held through the war began to fracture. The Soviet Union and the West eyed each other with mistrust, already preparing for a new kind of conflict. The soldiers who fought side by side now returned to a world uncertain of what peace even meant. For the men themselves, the real war began when the guns went silent. The nightmares, the memories, the empty seats at dinner tables. These were battles they could never win. Many found themselves strangers in their own homes, unable to explain what they had seen, what they had done. The medals they received could not erase the faces of those who never made it back. The dream that had once united them, of glory, of victory, of freedom, had been replaced by a quieter, heavier truth. They had survived, but survival had a cost. And in that silence after the last shot was fired, they began to understand that being the best had never been about killing more enemies or winning more battles. It was about enduring when everything inside you wanted to stop. It was about holding the line, not just for a country, but for the brother beside you. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in years. Across Europe and the Pacific, the guns fell silent. Smoke drifted above broken cities. Flags rose over ruins that once burned with hatred. The soldiers who had survived stood among the wreckage, not as victors, but as witnesses. They had seen the full measure of human strength and the full measure of its destruction. For men of the 1st Infantry Division, the journey had begun in North Africa and ended deep within Germany. They had crossed continents, fought through deserts, beaches, and cities reduced to rubble. They were no longer the young men who had once joked in foxholes or written home with trembling hands. They had become something older, harder, forged by every loss they carried. When they liberated the concentration camps, they realized the true nature of the evil they had been fighting. In those hollow-eyed survivors, they saw the reason for all their suffering. The victory they had earned was no longer about land or politics. It was about saving what was left of humanity. The 101st Airborne returned as legends. Their stand at Bastogne became part of military history, a symbol of unbreakable resolve. But most of them never thought of themselves as heroes. They remembered the cold more than the glory, the friends buried under snow more than the medals pinned to their chests. They came home to parades and headlines, but in their quiet moments, they thought only of those who hadn't stepped off the plane beside them. The Marines, scattered across the Pacific, carried scars that would never fade. The beaches of Tarawa, Saipan, and Okinawa had changed them forever. They had fought in places where surrender was unthinkable, where survival itself was an act of rebellion. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war, many Marines felt only emptiness. They had spent years preparing to invade Japan, ready to die in one final assault. Now it was over. The enemy was gone, but so was the purpose that had driven them. And the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, those Japanese-American soldiers who had fought harder than anyone to prove their loyalty, came home to a country still blinded by prejudice. They were welcomed as heroes in some places, ignored in others. Yet, in their quiet dignity, they never spoke with bitterness. They had fought not out of hate, but out of hope, a belief that America could live up to its own promise. History would eventually recognize them as one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history, but their greatest victory was moral, not martial. Each of these units left behind a legacy measured not by medals, but by memory. The 101st taught the world the meaning of endurance. The 1st Infantry embodied consistency and courage. The Marines showed that there is no limit to human resolve when faced with impossible odds. And the 442nd proved that loyalty and honor can transcend injustice. Together, they defined what it meant to be American in the truest sense, diverse, flawed, yet united by a common duty. When the soldiers returned home, they found a world eager to move on. Factories shifted from tanks to cars, cities lit up again, and life tried to resume its rhythm. But for many veterans, the war never truly ended. The noise lived inside them, the gunfire, the cries, the silence after the last explosion. They carried those sounds through the rest of their lives. Some buried them deep, others never could. Yet every time a flag rose or a bugle played, they remembered not the politics, not the strategy, but the faces of those who never came back. And so, when we ask today, what was the best U.S. military unit in World War II? The answer isn't found in numbers, in victories, or even in decorations. The best unit wasn't one that won the most battles, but the one that refused to break. It was a spirit that ran through all of them, from the frozen fields of Bastogne to the blood-soaked sands of Iwo Jima, from the deserts of Tunisia to the mountains of Italy. The best unit was every man who stood his ground when the world was falling apart. In the end, their true triumph was not in how they fought, but in what they preserved, a fragile belief that freedom, though costly, was worth every sacrifice. They carried that belief through darkness, so the rest of the world could wake in light. Decades later, as time fades their names and memories, their legacy remains carved into the conscience of history. They were ordinary men who did impossible things, bound by duty, courage, and the quiet understanding that greatness is born not from victory, but from endurance. And as history turns its pages, one truth endures. The best unit in World War II was not just a division, a regiment, or a company. It was a collective heartbeat of a generation that refused to surrender. Subscribe for more forgotten stories of World War II, where power, pride, and destiny collide in the shadows of history.